Situation down there in Houston, it's calamitous. Houston, we've got more than a problem. And the president is down. He made his way to Corpus Christi. He was listening to the local officials. I'm sure the federal aid is going to be coming in droves. It may just be the greatest reparations project in the history of the U.S. of A. Although I guess Hurricane Sandy in 2012, Katrina in 2005 were colossuses as well. But this one is of a different level. And it seems that many of the people did not have flood insurance. So where does that leave them? Let's find out how this whole thing would play out in terms of compensation or being indemnified and also protecting against catastrophic loss. Glenn McGillivray is the Managing Director for Catastrophic Loss Reduction with the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Now, as to the situation in Houston, would you say that these people who have maybe lost everything could have prevented this kind of loss monetarily, or even in some ways, they could have fortified their residences against maybe the floodwaters rising?
Well, I think when we talk about a typical rainstorm like we might see in Toronto, we at the Institute, we advocate that homeowners take action and do things to their property. But when you're looking at a storm of this caliber in Houston, you have to pull back and look at the bigger picture, the bigger environment. A sump pump system is not going to help you in that case. So, you have to look at bigger picture things like the disappearance of green space and wetlands and the crazy construction that's been going on in Houston and things of that nature. But certainly flood insurance would have helped, and only about 1 in 6 Houstonians have bought flood insurance.
Well, what if you live on a flood plain or in a low-lying area? Could you be mandated to buy it?
Well, that's the way it's supposed to work, at least in order to get a mortgage in the U.S., but that's kind of the theory. It doesn't always work in practice. Sometimes you get people buying flood insurance in order to get the mortgage, and then they'll cancel later. It's not a perfect system. Unfortunately, people, when they think of flood, they think about rivers and things of that nature, and if they're next to one, they might buy flood insurance. If they're far away from a river, they might think they're okay. But when you get a heavy rainstorm, the rivers often don't play a factor in it, and I think, people all over the place should think about flood insurance.
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, flood insurance, does it indemnify you against what might be an act of God?
Yeah, forget about that act of God thing. That's kind of a myth that's been created over the years. No insurance policy in Canada talks about act of God. In fact, the opposite is true. We cover just about every type of natural disaster in Canada. You do have to buy additional insurance for earthquake and for flood, but we cover everything else like hail and wind and water in basements and things of that nature. So that whole act of God thing has gotten out of hand, and I would completely discount it as kind of an old myth.
All right. Well, they say right now, low estimate would be about $35 billion in damage. Katrina cost about as much, but this is going to surpass that by most people's estimates. Flood coverage is something that may be separate to a comprehensive kind of package, would it not?
It is. It is in the U.S. It is in Canada. You do have to buy it as a separate coverage. Flood insurance has been around in the U.S. for a while now, and it is basically underwritten by the U.S. government. And unfortunately, it is not risk-based. The pricing is not risk-based. In other words, it's very cheap for Americans often to buy flood insurance, but that system is so badly in debt because of that fact. I think they owe something like $20 billion, and it'll be a lot more than that after Houston. That's a little different in Canada. Flood insurance is underwritten by the private insurance industry. It's only been around for about a year and a half. And we encourage people to really consider it because you don't have to live next to a river to get flooded, as people in Toronto and other places have seen in recent years.
Yeah, with a lot of rain and the storm sewers can't handle the capacity, things back up into the basement. And next thing you know, it's a major type of overhaul down there. But the disaster relief fund that the feds offer, I guess FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, if you don't have flood insurance, and I'm guessing the insurance companies would take the hit or indemnify you. If you don't have that, do the feds step in and help out, and to what extent?
They generally do. They do that in Canada as well. It's not enough money to make you whole again. with insurance, they try to make you whole. They try to put you back to where you were just before the loss happened. But with aid, it's generally just enough to get by, enough to maybe clean up your property a little bit, but it's often not enough to rebuild. And so I think a lot of people are going to be in really dire straits after this one.
As a rule here in Canada, in Toronto, if you've got, let's say, the average home, which now we're told is hovering around $1 million, what would flood insurance cost you annually?
I really don't know, to tell you the truth. There are only about, maybe 20 companies offering it right now. It's growing all the time, and I hear different numbers from different companies, but I think people should really be encouraged to talk to their broker or to their insurance company about it and see if it makes sense for them. Again, when we look at the claims that were filed after the 2013 flooding in Toronto, they were all over the place. They weren't next to rivers, and everybody thinks, well, I'm not near a river, I'm fine, but there are low-lying areas and other problem areas in places like Toronto, and particularly older places, older centers of cities. I really encourage homeowners to take a look and at least ask about overland flood insurance.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the water table could be high in a certain neighborhood or near a property. You could be on the lowest point in that neighborhood. I mean, the aging infrastructure, that could crumble. And as we say, plus you get those intense rainstorms. It's all a heads up and word to the wise. I mean, too late for the folks in Houston. Really, heart goes out to them, but this is going to be a colossal. Do you think any insurance companies, by the way, might even be put under because of the costs of having to indemnify?
It is a possibility, and I think about 7 or 8 companies went under as a result of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, 25th anniversary of that storm, by the way. It's very possible, and so I think we really have to keep an eye, or they have to keep an eye on that and see if what the fallout's going to be.
All right, hey, Glenn, good to talk to you. Thanks for all of the insight into this matter. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
You got it. Glenn McGillivray, Managing Director for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. Was the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction.